Hello, everybody. My name is Solimar Ortiz, and today joining with me is Dr. Paulette Dilworth, the Vice President of UAB's own Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, thank you for having me.
So my first question is, how did you become involved with UAB's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion?
Okay, so I joined the leadership here at UAB back in January of 2016. The position that I assumed here as the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer was posted, and the recruitment process was being managed by a search firm. And that search firm reached out to me to ask if whether or not I was interested in the role, and I pursued it and eventually went through the process of screening, working with the search committee and meeting different stakeholders on campus, and eventually was hired in this role. So I've been here now since 2016.
Wow, that's so incredible.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your position as Vice President. Like, what does that entail?
So as a chief diversity officer, I see my role as one of facilitator and champion. In other words, this is an opportunity to bring together all units across the university to facilitate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And to do that, we have to be strategic about what we see as our priorities. And one of the things that we've worked to do is to create a strategic diversity plan that allows us to prioritize our efforts. And within that strategic plan, we have 6 strategic goals that we're working towards as our priority for the next, well, this is our 3rd year. It's a 5-year plan, and we're now in our 3rd year of that plan.
So can you tell us a little bit more about these steps?
The first strategic priority is access and success. And what that translates to is making sure that we are doing our best effort to recruit faculty, staff, and students from diverse populations. And that when we bring people into the fold here at UAB, that they are provided with the support and the resources that they need to be successful, and that people are able to finish what they start here and see this as a place where the environment is welcoming and that they have a sense of belonging, that they should be here.
For our film festival, we're showing a lot of films that showcase things related to diversity within, racial minorities, LGBTQ plus, disabilities, etc. How do you feel that like having these types of topics discussed and showcased in films, why is that like important?
So I think that it's important for people and for us to acknowledge that the more we can learn about difference and how those differences come to define experiences for people, the more we can do to be supportive of each other. And so I think that it should be viewed as both a collective and an individual priority, that people would learn to be supportive of each other. But number one is educating yourself about what you don't know about differences. What is it that you really don't know or understand, say, for example, about the LGBT community? Don't be fearful of it. Challenge yourself to learn more. Put yourself in a position where you can ask the right questions so that you do have a better understanding of those communities. And it's important for people to learn about, see people like them, so that they have a way to make a connection that, this is doable, and it's not something that I'm out here walking a path alone, that it's clearly something that has been thought about. And the reason why is because here are examples of people who are being included in the narrative. And I think that it's important for those images, for people, different groups, for us to focus on that, and I would even argue that it's important for us to think about, as stories are being told, as film are being made, and that film might focus on a particular group, but you have to ask yourself the question, what's happening while this story is unfolding? What's happening, for example, with the Asian community? What's happening, for example, with the Latinx community? Or what's happening, for example, with African Americans? You have to ask yourself the question, and who's missing from the story? because those stories don't necessarily happen in isolation.
I think it's very interesting how like these different films, they can like relate to different people even, and like everybody can kind of see a bit of themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
even if they aren't a part of the community that that film is specifically addressing, they can not only find a part of them that can relate to them, but also
For example, you know, there's this big narrative around, say, the Civil War or some of the other founding narratives associated with the founding of this nation, right? But ultimately, the narrative has been reduced to the Black-white narrative associated with slavery, the enslavement of Black people. But you really do need to question, well, what was happening to the Native people while all these things were happening? What happened to Asian people? Because at some point, Asian people were introduced in the mix as well, as were Mexican and Latinos. And so how did those narratives parallel to really make a much more complete story? And how do we tell that story? You know, is important. And people need to be able to see themselves in that story.
That is true. There are very many parts of the narrative that have kind of been, as you would say, like passed over in history. So so having like films, you know, start to bring more attention to that, to those narratives of the minorities and that aren't really, they're kind of glossed over and not talked about. That's definitely significant and important.
Absolutely.
So earlier you were talking about the 5-year plan. Is there any other support resources that UAB has to offer for students and even faculty and staff that deal with identity related issues?
So we have what we characterize or refer to as affinity groups that we support through our office. So for example, the African American Faculty Association, the Asian Faculty Association, and then there's the Hispanic group. Pretty much any group that wants to create a start an affinity group can do that. We're happy to support them. And we have similar organizations in student affairs that are supported through Chris Jones's area, the programs and services to students, multicultural students. So it's that approach that we use in terms of setting up, allowing different groups to set up spaces where they can come together to support each other. And I think that that's something that really is important for people to know. That, you know, that people sometimes refer to that as separatism, but ultimately, you know, it goes back to that question that Beverly Tatum asked years ago: why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And if you really wanted to flip that question to ask, well, why are all the white kids sitting together in the cafeteria? They're sitting together for the same reason that Black kids are doing it, because people want to be with people like them, and they want to be in a space where they have a sense of belonging. They have a shared history, they have a shared understanding about who they are. And ultimately, there's nothing wrong with creating those spaces. And so therefore, to go back to the question, we do provide opportunities for resource and affinity groups to come together, you know, to sort of respond to the needs that they have that are specific to them.
What efforts do you think that students and staff or as individuals can make to ensure that UAB is a safe and inclusive campus to everybody?
Yeah, so two things actually. One, the first is to just be always mindful, you know, that we are a part of a collective, right? And that as a community, we do have a set of shared values that we live by, and to really get a deep sense of understanding what those values mean, and then working every day to breathe life into those values. And one of those values, of course, is our diversity and inclusiveness. And that's something that we should be very proud of, because I think that UAB basically has created a space here, unlike a lot of the other institutions where I've worked, where people can be successful. They can realize the goals that they've set for themselves. And then the other is, if you see something, say something. You know, sometimes I like to use the term ally, but I also now coming to, this is evolving for me, that we need people to be both allies, disruptors, and even accomplices in sort of disrupting the bad things that evolve sometimes from um, questions around diversity, people saying derogatory things or making derogatory, or even engaging in hostile behavior towards people, that we need people to interrupt things like that when it's happening. And I think that the more often we can set those things right, the more likely it is that we will see some of those kinds of negative experiences wane. I don't think we'll ever completely eliminate some of the hate and all those other things, but I think that people will be a lot more thoughtful before they act publicly about some of the things that they say and they do.
Thank you so much. That was everything that you said was so powerful and moving. And I think that a lot of people do need to understand this, and especially when you were saying to be more mindful. It's important to know that even as individuals, like, it can sometimes feel like we don't have the power to contribute to like the bigger issue. But there are steps that we can take to
Right.
make sure that even just here on our campus is a safer community, which will contribute to the greater society.
Right.
So thank you so much for participating. Again, this is Dr. Dilworth, the Vice President of UAB's own Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Sure. Well, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.